Well, I have made videos about Russia and India. I have made videos about China and America, but I still have not made a video about the place that I still call home, Australia, where I still call home. So why don't I change that and do a video about where Australia sees itself in the world, its foreign policy, and the Indo-Pacific, as articulated in a recent speech by Foreign Minister Senator Penny Wong, who delivered a speech at King's College London that received just a little bit of publicity back home in Australia, where she appeared to be criticising the British for being a nasty old colonial power. Welcome to the Burning Archive. This is a bit of a different video. It's about not other places in the multipolar world, but this place where I live, and which is, I guess, one of the poles in the multipolar world, a pole very, very closely aligned with America at the moment, but which could potentially imagine itself in a different way. But is that happening? As I asked in an earlier video, could Australia pivot to Delhi rather than remain fixated on Washington? Australia's a small country, but it's a wealthy country, and it's a country whose leaders see themselves as perhaps the most loyal ally of America in the world. So much so that some of the rhetoric and the actions coming out of Australia in recent years have attracted stinging criticism from China and Chinese leaders, some intense rebukes in the Global Times and other places. Australia has been strong and loud in its support for Ukraine and the NATO alliance in Ukraine. And it has been one of the most vocal advocates of the concept of the Indo-Pacific. It has asserted itself in recent years in the AUKUS arrangement with England or Britain and America in order to acquire nuclear submarines and other military technology. And it's also been a player in the Quad, the quadrilateral security dialogue with America, Japan, and India. Of course, Australia is very much the junior partner in the Quad with 25 million people, below Japan with 125 million, America with 331 million, and of course, India, perhaps the true leader of the free and fair world, with 1.4 billion people. So I can't quite do the maths there, but that's 14 times 4. So that's 64 times the population of Australia. And it's Australia's new Foreign Minister, Senator Penny Wong, since mid last year, following an election and change of government, has made a landmark speech in London at King's College London that has ruffled a few feathers in some of the local media back here in Australia, maybe also in Britain, for apparent criticisms of Britain as still harbouring colonialist attitudes. The sort of African-born British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly was even asked about whether he agreed with Penny Wong that Britain had not quite come to terms with its colonial past. This brief media brouhaha was really not a fair account of the speech, as you'll see in a moment. And it was perhaps not really picking up the main message of the speech, which rather than having a go at Britain for being colonialist, it was really inviting Britain into the Indo-Pacific with warm and welcoming, if somewhat cautious hands, and expressing undying love for American leadership of the world and the liberal rules-based order. But the speech is important to understand and to read between the lines a bit. What is Australia's vision of the multipolar world, if it has one? What is its attitude towards neocolonialism and even towards whether America's role in the world might need to shift? Does Australia see the shifting world as requiring a rebalancing of global institutions, or does it want to stick with the international rules-based order enshrining American dominance? What does Australia think should happen in the Indo-Pacific, and what does it mean by the Indo-Pacific? And how does the Australian Foreign Affairs Department's vision of the Indo-Pacific or the geostrategic environment compare to the complicated, sophisticated view of the changing multipolar world and the concept of the Indo-Pacific that was outlined in Dr. S.J. Shanker's India Way, as well as in many other speeches, some of which I've covered on other videos on this channel. Coincidentally, Dr. S.J. Shanker was in Australia this week, and he made world headlines by giving George Soros, the billionaire philanthropist and meddler in other governments, or promoter of open societies, a bit of a whack. And at the same time, the Indian cricket team is totally whacking Australia out of the park in the Test series, beating Australia by an innings and more. And I think, to be fair, if there were a Test match between the Indian Foreign Minister Dr. S.J. Shanker and the Australian Foreign Minister Ms. Penny Wong, or Senator Penny Wong, would probably win by an innings and more. But Penny Wong is still a novice Foreign Minister. Dr. S.J. Shanker has been a career diplomat since the mid-1970s. But I'm going to let you make up your mind about that, because I'm going to do a reaction video to this recent speech by Penny Wong. I'll play the video and I'll interrupt it every now and then to make a couple of comments. And I'm really looking at the speech from three angles. One is the sort of multipolar world, the concepts of how the multipolar world are changing that I talk a lot about on this channel. One is the concepts of history that are used in, or the accounts of history that are used in this speech, and how the stories we tell about history can inform us but can also mislead us. And I think there's perhaps that can support better mutual understanding of different countries, different cultures, or sometimes lead us into folly. And I think there's perhaps a little bit of both going on in Senator Wong's speech. And then finally, I'm also having a bit of a look at this speech as a former speechwriter. I did sort of kind of make my living in government in a way, writing speeches for a while. So, and I've done a few videos on this channel that sort of look at speeches of various world leaders and key figures in the multipolar world that bring some of that insight to it. So you can check those out on the channel. Make sure you watch to the end of the reaction part to the
was a member of our Parliament for 20 years, and he served as Minister for Defence and Minister for Foreign Affairs, and during those 6 years I sat at the cabinet table with him, and I know our bilateral relationship is in good hands. But most of all, thank you all for being here tonight, and can I say what a pleasure it is to be here at King's College, an institution with such a rich history. of thought and research on many of the biggest questions humanity faces. So it is fitting that through the new program being launched today, the first of its kind in the United Kingdom, that you're continuing to be at the vanguard, applying yourself to the geostrategic dynamics of the Indo-Pacific, the most consequential region of our time and likely to remain so for generations to come. When this esteemed college was founded in 1829, the Indo-Pacific was in large part a collection of European and British colonies, Australia among them. And for many decades after Australia federated in 1901, many Australians considered themselves British as well as Australian.
So I might just add here that we're kind of getting now into a little bit of historical interpretation from Penny Wong. And I'll sort of let it run, but it is an interesting part of this speech that it's part foreign policy, it's part the kind of, I guess, stock ideas about history that are articulated by a government minister and inform the judgments. And it's part just rhetoric. So let's just continue the story from there.
Still today, more than a third of the Australian population traces their ancestry back to the United Kingdom, and over 1 million British-born people call Australia home. But the nature of our nations, of our regions, and indeed our world has changed, and so too has the character of our relationship. In the 1920s, Australia went from essentially having our foreign policy determined by British ministers, as had been the case before the First World War, to developing our own thinking and practice in pursuit of our national interest. And after the end of the Second World War, as many of our neighbours gradually broke free of European colonial control, Australia built its own foreign service, and our foreign policy turned its focus to what we now call the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, so first comment here, of course, is this is a pretty, well, I guess it's a reasonable version of the history of Australian foreign policy, but it's a highly partial one, and probably sort of downplays, I guess, a lot of the early sort of role of Australia, including, you know, we just allied over sort of World War One, I guess. Billy Hughes' role in the Versailles Peace Conference and his acquisition for Australia of former German colonies like Papua New Guinea as colonies of Australia. But all of that's happened before the 1920s that Penny Wong sort of picks the story up from. And of course, insane after the end of the Second World War, many of our neighbours gradually broke free of European colonial control. It's an interesting version of events, I guess, as well, one that rather downplays the significance of India's wars of independence leading to its independence in 1947-48 and partition, etc., and the slow detachment of the British from their African colonies after that. But in broad terms, it is fair enough. What it really doesn't include, I guess, is any discussion of Australia's swing to Washington after the fall of Singapore in 1942 and its intimate involvement with America in the entire post-Second World War period. Anyhow, let's get back to the speech.
In the 1970s, former Prime Minister Gough Whitlam shifted Australia's perspective from Asia as a place in which things happened to a group of countries with which things happened.
Again, this is,
And in 1992, former Prime Minister...
without getting too pedantic, nothing's happened in the 1950s, 60s. The very simplified version of events. And really, she's just calling out the former Labor Prime Ministers. And I guess this is something that political leaders do tend to do, only sort of acknowledging the role of their side of politics role in shaping foreign policy, but it gives an extremely distorted view of Australia's foreign policy since 1945, including, of course, discounting the role of Malcolm Fraser, who subsequently was rather critical of Australia's deep attachment to the American alliance. Anyhow, let's resume the story without my editorial.
Mr Paul Keating urged Australians to accept the geophysical reality of our place in the region, to accept that we had a rightful presence in the region. And today, as a modern multicultural country, home to people of more than 300 ancestries and the oldest continuing culture on Earth, we see ourselves as being in the Indo-Pacific and being of the Indo-Pacific. And the modern face of Australia...
Well, I really don't know anyone amongst my company who see themselves as being part of the Indo-Pacific. We certainly see ourselves being part of a multicultural, multipolar world. But the Indo-Pacific is a term beloved by pro-American security analysts and foreign policy analysts in Australia. It is not a term that people popularly identify with, although, of course, as I've mentioned in my video on Indian soft power, below the British, the two largest groups, population, country of birth groups in Australia now, after the British, are Chinese and Indian. So we're certainly seeing a changing cultural complexion of Australia.
Just as the modern face of Britain is readily apparent both among our citizens at large and our political leaders. Take my own example. In 1836, just 2 years after Westminster passed the South Australian Colonisation Act, my mother's great-great-grandparents were some of the first British to settle in South Australia. That ancestral connection with Britain has been standard among the men and women who have served in my role. But the other side of my family had a very different experience of British colonisation. My father is descended from Hakka and Cantonese Chinese. Many from these clans laboured in the British North Borneo Company, in tin mines and plantations for tobacco and timber. Many worked as domestic servants for British colonists, as did my own grandmother. Sometimes such stories can feel uncomfortable for those whose stories they are and for those who hear them. But understanding the past enables us to better share the present and the future.
I might just rewind that so I don't get the little phone sound. But this is the part of the speech that a lot of fuss was about. So let's listen carefully and see whether she's actually making some jibe at the British for not being comfortable with or not coming to terms with their role as a colonial power.
To settle in South Australia. That ancestral connection with Britain has been standard among the men and women who have served in my role. But the other side of my family had a very different experience of British colonisation. My father is descended from Hakka and Cantonese Chinese. Many from these clans laboured in the British North Borneo Company, in tin mines and plantations for tobacco and timber. Many worked as domestic servants for British colonists, as did my own grandmother. Sometimes such stories can feel uncomfortable for those whose stories they are and for those who hear them. But understanding the past enables us to better share the present and the future. It gives us the opportunity to find more common ground than if we stay sheltered in narrower versions of our country's histories. It helps open the world to us, the Indo-Pacific to us.
So I really don't think you can say this is a big jibe at British colonialism or guests or hosts. The starting sentence about the ancestral connection with Britain has been standard among the men and women who have served in my role is probably a little bit, brings attention to the heritage that she's proud of. But I think, given Prime Minister of India is currently a Prime Minister of Britain is a practicing Hindu, and there's multiple ministers from African and Indian backgrounds in the British cabinet, probably means the story she's telling there is as powerfully true in Britain as it is in Australia. So, but I guess it's nonetheless something that is important, but really what she's doing is inviting some reflections on understanding the past and the present, which of course at the Burning Archive we love to do. The past is real and part of the present. And I think her comment that it's an opportunity to find common ground rather than staying in narrow versions or staying sheltered in narrower versions of our country's histories is true. However, I guess I'd probably say this speech also sounds like quite a narrow version of Australia's foreign policy, or quite a narrow version of our country's history of foreign policy, and as you'll see later, doesn't reflect terribly much breadth of vision about the histories of other countries in the Indo-Pacific as well, not least of which includes Russia and China. Anyhow, let's listen.
As Foreign Minister, I've had the privilege of visiting 24 Indo-Pacific countries in my first 6 months on the job. It's quite a few. This work has rendered crystal clear that one of the most important ways our countries can modernise our relationships is in the story we tell the world about who we are, which of course is the starting point of your foreign policy. At the same time as we continue to invest in our longer-standing relationships, we are engaging ever more closely with the region and making the case for greater global focus on our region. Indeed, that will be a major focus this week, when I will participate in the annual Australia-UK Minister.
So we're sort of leaving India and the Pacific behind now and talking about the Britain, I guess. So nice introduction, but I guess I don't know if we're really fulfilling the point. However, good points for her understanding of the importance of telling the right stories about our history. Anyhow, this is a bit of a boring part of the speech because it's talking about the ministers of defence and their arrangements and just
countering disinformation and much more.
But listen to this.
To that end, our discussions will explore ways we can together achieve better connectivity and engagement across the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions.
The Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific region. So we have a new concept of region now, which seems to encompass 4 oceans of the world, but excludes certain major countries of the world. Anyhow, let's carry on.
In 2021, your government's integrated review made the case for the United Kingdom to engage more deeply with the Indo-Pacific, calling it, and I quote, critical to our economy, our security and our global ambition to support open societies. It described the Indo-Pacific as the world's growth engine, accounting for 17.5% of your global trade and 10% of inward foreign direct investment. It said, home to half the world's people, 40% of global GDP, some of the world's fastest growing economies, at the forefront of global trade arrangements, leading and adopting digital and technological innovation and standards, investing strongly in renewables and green tech, and vital to our goals for investment and resilient supply chains. Especially as the UK adjusts to a post-Brexit economy, its interest in engagement is obvious.
Now, I might just briefly add here that lumping together all the countries of the Indo-Pacific and Australia tends to use a very eccentric definition of Indo-Pacific that doesn't include all the countries that border on the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. I mean, the coast of Russia in the Pacific Ocean is probably larger than the coast of America in the Pacific Ocean. But nonetheless, I think this kind of concept of the Indo-Pacific kind of lumps it together as just another great big opportunity for us to develop our markets in. And I think it probably is nowhere near as complicated and sophisticated as the understanding of the multiple currents of culture, societies, politics, and economies that you would get from Dr. S.J. Shanker's The India Way. So if you really want to understand the Indo-Pacific, I'd probably check out my video on Jay Shanker's book, The India Way, or even better, read Jay Shanker's book on the Indian Way. Anyhow, back to the speech.
Well, of course, Australia has its own benefits to gain from economic engagement in the region. But I want to say to you tonight, we see two broader imperatives for economic engagement. Advancing prosperity for all is in itself a good thing. Doing what we can to alleviate poverty and lessen disadvantage is the right thing to do. It's not only a contribution to humanity's betterment, it is an investment in our own security. Stability and prosperity are mutually reinforcing. The countries of the region are ambitious for growth, opportunity and prosperity, and we've seen this in the remarkable trajectories of development in these last decades. We see it in the region's contribution to global growth, and there is much more to come. Australia is part of this, and we want to be part of this. And we also want this to be understood by our partners in the region, that we share interests beyond the security issues that can so dominate discussion, that we understand that their success is our success, that we know that closer economic ties have benefited us all. So for Australia, our membership of CPTPP, RCEP, APEC and IPEF, and our trade agreements with ASEAN, China, Japan, India, New Zealand, the Republic of Korea, the US, underline our view that our national interest lies at being at every table where Indo-Pacific economic integration is being discussed and actualised.
Now, it's one thing to talk about connectivity between Indo-Pacific cultures, economies and societies, but what she's talking about there is Indo-Pacific economic integration, with a close link between security interests and economic interests, which I guess is all code for, well, let's be blunt, the American empire.
You see, membership of these economic partnerships reinforces the rules-based trade in our region that is so vital to modern trading nations like Australia
liberal
and the UK.
International order.
So we welcome the many ways, both in words and deeds, that the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt has progressed. The integrated review's logic has been accepted and is now being refreshed to take into account the way the world has changed in the last couple of years. And we look forward to seeing what shape it takes in today's circumstances. We were heartened to see the United Kingdom become the first country to become an ASEAN
So she's
partner in
buttering up
25
her
years.
guests
It's
here,
both a
really
signal of
saying,
your intent to support the
you
region's
know, they're
priorities,
welcome to be
as
part of
well
the
as of
Indo-Pacific,
ASEAN,
even though
seeking to
Britain
bring in
is a very
additional,
long way
capable
in the
and responsive
Indo-Pacific
partners.
and has a rather
Australia became
dark,
ASEAN's first dialogue
uncomfortable
partner in
colonial past
1974,
there.
almost 50 years ago. And both our nations recognise the centrality of ASEAN to the region. The UK's request to accede to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, one of the most ambitious trade deals ever concluded, is also meaningful. Like Australia and other CPTPP members, the UK is committed to trade liberalisation and the highest standard of trade and investment rules. And this approach has been underlined in our recently concluded bilateral free trade agreement, which in itself sets a high standard. And you've increased your diplomatic footprint in the Pacific, opening 3 high commissions in Pacific Island countries in 3 years. Like Australia, the United Kingdom is also a founding member of the Partners in the Blue Pacific Initiative, which will enhance partner coordination to support Pacific priorities. So we understand there is great opportunity in the Indo-Pacific. There is much to be optimistic about. But it doesn't only matter this because of the opportunity it offers. The Indo-Pacific matters most consequentially to us all, because it is the region in which the reshaping of our world is centred. As security and economic dynamics that have held for decades are shifting, the strategic environment is changing, and we all have a role to play in this reshaping. Despite being part of the region, Australia has not all.
Now, that little section there about reshaping, you might compare or contrast that with Dr. S.J. Shanker's discussion of the Indo-Pacific being the new arena for the great game where different powers display their strategic prowess. And perhaps Australia here is asserting its desire to display some of its strategic prowess in wanting to reshape the region. But again, and I'll probably come back to this at the end of the video, that the extent of real clear thinking about what the hell is the changing multipolar world and how Australia's concept of the Indo-Pacific really helps us get to those new relationships and international developments is a little bit moot, I think.
Always listened well to the countries of Southeast Asia and of the Pacific, and we've not often listened as carefully as we could have. Well, our government is working to change that. We take an approach that puts listening above lecturing, that aligns Australia's interests with those of our partners, whether on climate, infrastructure, food security, or economic development, opportunity and resilience. An approach that respects the sovereignty and agency of the countries of the region, that doesn't force people to choose sides, but asks people to choose what sort of region they want, and asks them to work with us on achieving that together. In this, we must exercise agency. We're not bystanders in this story. I said last year at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, we are not hostages to history. We decide what we do with the present, and we decide what we do to help shape the region that we want.
I do applaud Penny Wong's apparent interest in history, but I think she probably should kind of upgrade her rhetoric and the sophistication of some of her quotes and thinking about history. This is just a rather awkward restatement of, I think, Marx's comment that, men make their own history, but not under circumstances of their own making.
We want to live in a region and a world that is peaceful and predictable, where our countries and our peoples can cooperate, trade and thrive, where our relations are based on partnership, where we respect the agency and leadership of regional institutions, whether they be ASEAN or the Pacific Island Forum. It's clear to me from my travels that this is what most of the region wants, as does the United Kingdom.
I suspect she's subtly communicating here a bit of discontent in the Pacific about Britain coming back and throwing its weight around. And she's sort of gently reminding the Brits in her audience that not everyone welcomes Britain back to the Indo-Pacific. So they ought to be a little bit better in how they go about it this time.
We all seek partnerships that are transparent, that create economic and social value. We all desire a region where no country dominates and no country is dominated. The kind of economic engagement that I have outlined is part of how we all contribute to this and demonstrate our stake in that priority. But the other key element is working with partners to uphold the agreed international rules that underwrite our stability, prosperity, and our sovereignty.
Well, as leaders of China say, leaders of Russia, leaders of most countries around the world, hang on, which agreed international rules are they? This is the mythical liberal rules-based order with a set of rules no one can actually point to, but largely mean America does what it wants.
For just as we have a role to play in the reshaping of our region, so too do we all have a role to play in defending the rules-based order. As a region, we know the sharp edge of strategic competition. We have experienced our situation becoming more dangerous and more volatile. I've said many times that we face the most challenging strategic circumstances of the post-war period. Our region is home to the largest military build-up anywhere in the world in that period, with limited transparency and reassurance. North Korea conducted more than 60 ballistic missile launches last year. Last August, 5 Chinese ballistic missiles were reported to have fallen in Japan's exclusive economic zone.
This is a very curious statistic, and it's a very big claim that it's the most challenging strategic circumstances since 1945. I'm not convinced it really stacks up, although I'm terribly worried about the prospect of a conflict between China and America. What it really seems to be saying is there's a challenge to American supremacy in the Western Pacific. And the comment that this is the largest military build-up anywhere in the world since 1945, I don't know how that is measured or how that can be assessed, and particularly how it can be assessed without some reference to the American bases in the Philippines and in Australia and in Japan and so on and so forth. And again, a lot of that tension is more around the South China, South Sea, Taiwan, etc., blah, 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 rather than the very large concept of the Indo-Pacific.
We must always remember that if conflict were to break out in the Indo-Pacific, it would be catastrophic.
Oh yeah, we'd be wrecked.
Okay. So Australia sees our investment in our future defence capabilities as essential for deterring conflict and maintaining a strategic balance in the Indo-Pacific. A balance where regional peace prevails and the sovereignty of all nations, large and small, is preserved. We are resolved to have capabilities that contribute to the strategic equilibrium I've described. Our historic AUKUS partnership with the United Kingdom and the United States will help us maintain our capability in the Indo-Pacific into the future and complement our collective efforts to ensure regional security and regional stability. This has been a genuinely collaborative effort between 3 close and long-standing partners. And we are fast approaching a decision on the optimal pathway forward for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines, which of course will be discussed at our ministerial meetings this week. We welcome the UK's effort to promote the accepted rules of freedom of navigation through the Carrier Strike Group deployment, which toured more than 40 countries last year and continues to engage in the region. The deployment of UK and European naval assets to the Indo-Pacific adds to strategic equilibrium and collective deterrence in the.
So she's welcoming the Brits and the French, etc., sending aircraft carriers and whatnot to assert their presence in the Indo-Pacific and to help out the US Navy with all its bases in the West Pacific. I find this all a bit regrettable from my point of view.
Region. But more than that, it is a tangible assertion of the openness of the global commons on which our shared prosperity depends. Our military capability is a key part of how we manage strategic competition, but it is only one part of it. Alongside new acquisitions and exercises, we must keep focus on diplomacy, economic openness, and upholding the rules, working with our regional partners in the Pacific, ASEAN, Northeast Asia and the Quad. To be truly effective in the region, we need to offer countries choices. After all, not being forced to choose means having real choices. Choices in areas that count, like investment, innovation, education, energy transition and more. Choices that help countries protect their own sovereignty. And we need to engage transparently and as equals from common ground. The strategic challenges I have outlined are not ones faced only by our region. In Europe, we are also seeing attempts to rewrite or sideline long accepted rules and norms of international law. That's why the Australian government and the Australian people, like the UK's government and people, care so deeply about the situation in Ukraine. And it is why we have committed considerable resources to help Kyiv defend its territorial integrity. This includes last month deploying 70 ADF personnel to support a multinational effort to train Ukrainian troops here in the United Kingdom. Not just out of solidarity with the Ukrainian people, and in opposition to one of the most flagrant violations of the most basic tenets of the UN Charter in recent memory. But for this reason, we see Russia's attack on Ukraine as an attack on all, and on the fundamental norm of territorial integrity and of sovereignty.
So I'm not really going to comment on all that. I've done a whole bunch of videos on the whole Ukraine situation, but I guess we're just professing our loyalty to the American war against Russia there. I guess we're just stating Australia's quite vocal position in support of the American and NATO approach to the Ukraine conflict there.
As we are here in London, it seemed fitting that I would conclude these remarks by quoting one of your great poets. No man is an island entire of itself, and every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. The language may...
Well, it's wonderful as a poet to see a bit of poetry used in speeches, but I don't know. I mean, if you're going to deliver a line of poetry in a speech, you kind of probably need to deliver it with a little bit more performance and meaning there, and perhaps be just a little bit more imaginative in your choice of lines of poetry. Dunn's poetry, of course, the line is from his poem that ends, "Do not ask for whom the bell tolls," as in the bell of death. It tolls for thee, and perhaps this is some unconscious recognition by Penny Wong of the decline of the American empire.
Reflect the time, but the sentiment still holds. Australia, like Britain, is an island, and I reflect on my friend James Cleverley's observations. on why a peaceful, prosperous island nation engages with foreign policy. In our modern, tightly woven world, what happens in Europe reverberates in the Indo-Pacific.
You do wonder, actually, whether Penny Wong realises that about the full meaning of this poem. But yeah, there we go.
And what happens in the Indo-Pacific reverberates in Europe. No region, indeed no country, is an island. Australia understands this. We are committed to working with you, with our partners and with our region, to help build the alignment we need so that we can shape the region and the world we want, stable, prosperous, secure and respectful of sovereignty. Because despite the grim comparisons between today's global circumstances with the darkest eves of human history, remember this: we decide what we do with the present, and our own actions determine our own future. Thank you very much.
And of course, in those dark eves of human history, people decided what they did in the present, also in their own actions, determined our past, I guess. So, but that's the speech. I'll just pop onto a different camera screen and give you my quick wrap up now. So that is Penny Wong's speech. I'd rate it as moderate to good on speechcraft, clear, well presented. Probably needs to learn how to speak poetry with a little bit more vim and vigour. A bit weak on history, a very partial account, I think, of the history of the Indo-Pacific or the history even of Australian foreign policy. And I'd say a little bit poor on understanding the changing multipolar world, which really ought to be the central task of any good foreign minister, any good diplomat. I think it was especially muddy on the concept of the Indo-Pacific. Indeed, Australian diplomats have kind of, I think some of them even claim they invented the concept, although if you read Dr. Jaishankar's The India Way, the chapter on the Pacific Indian, you will see the concept has a bit of an older history than that, and that quite a few countries seem to claim responsibility for its recent fashionability. Nonetheless, Australia's put its bid in. Who am I to dispute it? But it did remind me of one of Dr. Jaishankar's remarks, I think, in India Way, which was that Britain, the British Empire, operated Indo-Pacific strategy for a long time in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it was far from free and open. So at least to my mind, I think the Indo-Pacific has got a little way to go, and Australian diplomacy has got a little bit of a way to go in terms of really explaining that idea. Let me know in a comment below if you would like a video on this whole concept of the Indo-Pacific, what it means, what some of the history is, and how it's really playing out. And global viewers also might be interested, especially global viewers in India might well be interested to know that a debate is breaking out a bit in Australia about its Australian foreign policy. There's a few people getting a little bit understandably nervous about our lockstep march with America and whether that will draw us into a war with China. A war that would, well, it would destroy Australia catastrophically, I would have thought. And I'll include in the description below a recent piece in the Pearl and Irritations website, which is a website kept by John Menadue, a former head of the Prime Minister's Department in the 1970s in Australia, who indeed led the move, the more sort of Asia-oriented foreign policy that Penny Wong referenced in her speech, who is fiercely critical of Australia's current elites' utter dependence and servility to America. And indeed, there's been a quite important book published as well by, his name's Colin Fernandez, Sub-Imperial Power, which I also might cover in another video. So that's a little bit of a teaser for some future content. I think if those voices for a more independent approach in Australia to its foreign policy, to a more understanding approach to the multipolar world and the realities of the Indo-Pacific, of the realities of India's rise and China's rise and Russia's significance, and the downside of having 800 American military bases all around the world. It very much depends on supporting independent voices like me on YouTube and in the media who can help, as I think I said in a previous video, help Australia pivot from Washington to Delhi, help Australia be an ally of the Pandavas, to exercise Krishna's choice, as Dr. Jaishankar said in his video referencing the Mahabharata, of course. So if you'd like to help me pivot Australia to Delhi and to a better understanding of the genuine multipolar world, to help understand how history really affects us today and learn some of the ordinary virtues of governing well, including how to write a good speech, do subscribe to my newsletter. Subscribe to this channel, share it, and tell a friend about it, because I'd love to grow my audience and have some of these ideas shared with more people around the world. And I'll see you in the next video.